Thank you. We're recording and ready to begin. The first item of business is to look at the minutes of the last meeting, February 17. Are there any corrections or additions that people would like to make to that document? Okay, hearing none, we accept them as written. Thank you. I think they are very straightforward, so I'm not surprised by that. And on our agenda today, we've got some updates, legislative updates, and then a discussion of the transportation working group and our task group, and then the biomass task group. Is there anything else that folks would like to put on the agenda?
Yeah, I have my hand up actually to make an agenda change addition, if I could.
Please, Jane.
Either at the beginning or probably at the beginning would be easiest. I just wanted to talk about subcommittee composition quickly.
Please. Let me see if Peter has opening remarks, and then we can turn to that, Jane.
No, I'm excited to be back with you all. I think we have some good conversations to have today. I'm particularly interested in the update from transportation working group and discuss with you all sort of the biomass working group and ways in which we can engage our full subcommittee in that conversation. So,
all right, thanks, Peter. So, Jane.
So briefly, there is an open nomination process right now for subcommittee nominations. 3 subcommittees in particular have had focused and interested components that they wanted to add, expertise, I should say, to their subcommittees. So science and data, rural resilience, and just transitions have an open nomination process online. And you'll recall that both cross-sector and ag and ecosystems weren't having folks leaving the subcommittee or didn't feel new expertise was needed. So there was no open process for nominations. We did officially move TJ over to this subcommittee from science and data and appointed Claire on science and data and as he transitioned over here. I did, just because we have an opportunity, I wanted to bring up, and while there wasn't an open process, AOT has reached out and suggested that Andrea Wright in her new position as the AOT Environmental Policy Manager would like Michelle and Secretary Flynn would like to request that Andrea formally sit on the cross-sector subcommittee. So it's a little, I think I can't imagine anybody would not agree that having an official AOT rep makes a lot of sense, especially in the light of the substantive work that we're doing now around transportation. But I will say that it's a little funny since we have this open nomination process for the other subcommittees. I think that that's okay though, because I think this is a really discrete area of expertise and something that's really been missing from an official appointment on this subcommittee for our AOT representation. So if folks concur, the subcommittee could recommend Andrea's appointment to the subcommittee, and we would bring it forward to the steering committee when they meet the first week of April to formally bless and approve as we talk about shifts in all the subcommittees. So hopefully, just wanted to bring that up early and hope that the subcommittee concurs.
Thank you, Bram. Any other comments, Jared? Joey, I was going to ask you.
I think you heard from Gina in the chat as the Transportation Task Group co-leads. I think we would both be very excited to bring that capacity into the fold. So I would fully support, and I hope this team would make a recommendation to the steering committee to do that as well.
Any other comments? I'm only seeing positive nods. All right then, Jane, I think you.
Quickly, Rich, I think it might be useful for us to address the second part of Jane's comment, who is essentially sort of, we haven't had an open, do we want to consider any sort of open call for additional membership? I think the V-Trans piece has probably frankly been an oversight to not have that on since the beginning. But so I just wanted to raise the question that was sort of buried within the conversation.
Any
One thing I'll
comment?
just add, I was just going to add that Marion and I met with Iris earlier this week because I think you all know is a council member and represents the youth voice on the council. Iris has no immediate plans to transition off the council, but likely is an imminent step down in the coming year as she transitions to college. So we were starting to think with her and around replacement for her and support and infrastructure going forward to, around the youth voice and the capacity that they should and could bring across more than just one person to the subcommittees. And so I'll just mention that Iris has put forward a proposal that sets up an infrastructure to have youth representation on the council continued, but then also on all subcommittees, so that all subcommittees have a member of the youth voice represented to impact and assess progress. And so Iris has put forward a number of recommendations through the subcommittee nomination process. And without having brought this proposal to the steering committee yet, Marion did take the liberty on our behalf of adding into the subcommittee nomination process youth. When you go to the nomination process survey online, it articulates specific expertise that folks are looking to fill on science and data or rural resilience. And there's now a bucket for youth representation for all subcommittees. And so that's now up there. We haven't really actively drawn people to that yet, and we'll talk about it with the steering committee, but did just want to mention that we hope and expect that the steering committee would support the idea of having a youth rep on all 5 subcommittees going forward.
Christine?
Jane, how generally are folks defining youth, just to help me think about? Is college age too old?
No, actually, some of Iris's nominations are at UVM. One in particular I noticed is at UVM, but I haven't actually asked Iris what she defines and what we define. But yes, there is a college-age student nominated right now that's intended to serve that role.
Would recently passed college be eligible? Is that probably getting too far along? I'm just thinking of a couple people that I know of who've been interns at EAN.
Guess I'd have to, I'm not ready to define what a youth person
Okay, all right.
right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm recently past college.
Yeah, I think about, 64 and down is about right.
Probably in leadership and government, that would be
65 is the new 18.
Yeah, so I gather this will be taken up by the steering committee and it seems like a recommendation that's got to come from the steering committee or the full council. So we could weigh in on it today conversationally, but that's about it. And any other comments on that one? All right, thanks. Thanks, Jane. Anything else to add to the agenda? Then I guess we should get into the legislative updates. We've got at least 3 moving bills, and it'd be good to hear a report on each of them. Anybody want to speak to the clean heat standard? Jared, maybe you've been closely following it, or Peter?
I'm happy to start, and then others can add on who are more close to the legislative process. I can share what is in the news, which is that the Clean Heat Standard bill passed on a second reading in the House yesterday by a vote of 96 to 44 with 9 members absent. So that recommendation in the climate action plan, that single largest emissions reducing policy recommendation in our plan, received very strong support in the Vermont House yesterday. And my understanding is that I think there's a kind of a final third reading, but that I believe will happen today. But I think that the main vote was yesterday, and from there it will move on to the Senate for consideration. I do not have a sense of the timeline or the committee that it will go to in the Senate, but in terms of tracking progress of where key recommendations in the climate action plan are, that big one just made a big step forward.
Hey, excellent. Any expectation of when the Senate will, we don't know even what committee it's going to in the Senate, is that right?
No, it's an open conversation, and for those who aren't deeply versed in the committees of jurisdiction conversation in the Senate, there's a bit of a split jurisdiction between Senate Finance, which oversees PUC activity, and Senate Natural Resources Energy, which does sort of the normal energy work. And so it's a question of which committee it might go to. And as of earlier this week, I don't think that decision had been made. So.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Any questions? I think I can report that the legislation actually was very well handled in the House, in House Energy and Technology, very thoughtfully and deeply considering the recommendations of the council. And I think the committee did a very thorough job on it. So when it got to the floor, it really had been thoughtfully examined, but by the committee, and they were able to make that case. Joey and then Christine.
I guess the only thing I would add is, just so people know, I think they lengthened the time for public process, which, just so our people are aware that there will be an opportunity, I think guided in part by, the Just Transitions recommendations, and, to have more time for the public process. So I think it's like a 2+ year endeavor to essentially set it up, to hear from stakeholders and move it forward. So just wanted to note that.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. Yeah, and from the point of view of meeting the 2030 standards, it has the potential of creating, a bit more of a crunch. On the other hand, by extending the public period for public process, it adds to the openness of the proposal to the public generally.
Well, one thing just on that note, really quickly, sorry, Christine, I believe that the bill enables, compliant entities to sort of track back to January 2022. So if people are looking at the writing on the wall that this is a policy that's going to move forward, then they get to count the things that are likely to be clean heat measures towards compliance. So yeah. To the degree, I mean, your point on timing is right, but I just want to let people know that there is a, they want to enable that. So it's in the bill as it stands.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. Yeah, we would be very frustrated, I think, if we sent a message that you should delay implementing clean heat standards because you won't get credit for them. So you should delay until 2025. Obviously, we don't want to send that message to people.
That'll tie into our conversation here on weatherization and the ARPA dollars flowing through, and how important it is that those money get invested now to drive early action, which will have all sorts of benefits to the clean heat standard. Sorry, Christine.
No, great. That's correct, Peter. Christine.
Yeah, no sorries necessary. It's good to have that iteration. Peter's comment about the committee jurisdictional decisions and whether it's finance or natural resources or whatever, I thought was an interesting one. And perhaps I'm the only one that didn't think about this angle when I was doing my part of the work on the cap, but in thinking about, okay, what we're recommending is clearly going to result in legislative action. And is it clear in my mind which committees would likely be undertaking this? And is there anything I could be doing in helping to frame up the many steps that eventually, hopefully, will lead to legislation to help make it more clear whether this is fundamentally, let's just say, for example, theoretically, a finance oversight kind of legislate proposal, or more of a classic, energy resources sort of proposal. So anyway, I don't know if that's more a note to myself in future processes like this, or whether it's an observation that's of value to the subcommittee. But I must say, I didn't think about whether there was any language I could be using or not using to help make it more clear which committee's jurisdiction I would hope would be overseeing the decision.
Yeah,
I'm
those are.
no great expert on the legislative ins and outs, frankly, but Christine, I don't think that our language affects that very much. I think that the reasons why assignments are made to different committees involve many things, including the workload of the committees working on other bills. And and how we framed it has very little to do with that. So I would not worry about that.
Okay.
No, and interestingly, there's a fair amount of overlap in between the two committees in terms of membership. And so you're going to get some of the same consideration regardless of which committee it's in. And it really is sort of like an inside baseball for the Senate to decide how they want to have those.
Right.
So.
Thank you.
Is someone prepared to talk about the progress of weatherization initiatives, including the ARPA money that Peter just referred to? Peter, is that you?
I think that might be TJ or Jane.
I could speak a little bit to it, although maybe Jane, if you want to take the workforce portion. So the proposal for $80 million for weatherization using ARPA money seems to be moving forward apace. I believe that's $45 million for OEO for low income weatherization. That also includes some funding for other measures like heat pumps or health and safety measures, some panel upgrades, and $35 million via the Department of Public Service to Efficiency Vermont for moderate income weatherization. That funding does not include any of those add-ons as proposed, but I'll just note tangentially or in addition, there's $20 million that have been proposed for panel upgrades and electric service upgrades consistent with the recommendations of this committee and the Climate Council. Although I think this committee recommended more dollars. All of those were recommended by House Energy Technology to appropriations with recommendations for approving for appropriations. It's been discussed in the Senate side, although it's not clear to me. Jane or Peter, you may know better exactly where that stands in the Senate side. Senate Natural Resources discussed and took presentations on the funding, but did not. They didn't ultimately make a recommendation saying essentially that appropriations will deal with it, is my understanding. One thing that I do want to note about weatherization and the clean heat standard, and I think it's something for this committee to think about, is that there is a perception maybe that the clean heat standard will be the sustainable funding source to continue ramping up weatherization after the ARPA money going forward. And I think there's some need to discuss that and maybe change that perception. I think it could provide some additional funding, but not to the pacing that would be necessary to meet 90,000 additional homes by 2030. And I think there's well, I won't get into projecting the future, but we should just discuss how that plays into a clean heat standard or other options for that kind of long-term sustainable funding for weatherization. So it's still an issue out there, and I just raise it because I don't want there to be a misconception that the clean heat standard is going to, promote weatherization and ensure we don't have kind of a funding cliff after ARPA, because I just don't think that's true. And so now might not be the best time, but I'll just throw that out there. And I'll turn it to Jane for cleaning up anything that I misstated about where things are with the weatherization or adding workforce.
No, that was great. Thanks, TJ. And I'm sure many of you know that there's the bill that for weatherization that came out of Senate Natural Resources and Energy that includes component funding for workforce. It also includes money for OEO that seems to be less, but for the same purposes as the ARPA dollars, but is general fund directed. 20 million to OEO for low-income weatherization assistance program, and all of the other workforce stuff in Senate Natural Resource and Energy's bill is general fund, is supposed to come from the general fund. So it's confusing, to say the least, what's going on there. There was a read on it yesterday on two of the pieces from VTC that would go to VTC in Senate Education yesterday. And I'll just say that the link there around those workforce dollars was not made very strongly to weatherization. It was made towards investment in green jobs, but they kept speaking to solar really more than much to do with weatherization. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen with Senator Bray's bill and whether or not it has any traction to go anywhere. He has said he supports the ARPA recommendation, and hopefully that will stay intact as 80 million. So we'll see.
I think that's important. If anybody is asked, it'd be good to make sure that we keep that $80 million moving forward as project dollars as much as possible. And if there's additional desire for further workforce development, that happen as an addition to the project dollars.
I should also note just the amount. I think that we and OEO estimated that this $80 million is roughly doubling the number of weatherizations that would have happened otherwise. So instead of 10,000 weatherizations over 4 years, we're talking about close to 20,000, like 18 to 20,000. So again, it's kind of ramping up, but then we need to figure out going forward.
All right, thanks, TJ. And also thanks for the note around the question of how much support would weatherization likely get from clean heat standard implementation. I think that's an important point. And it's something that it's a question I had to answer specifically to the committee, the House committee, and I made the point that we could not depend on the clean heat standard to be a principal source of financing for weatherization. And we shouldn't, in fact, because weatherization requires so much additional support that we should not take our eye off the ball on those other sources of revenue that are needed. And Jared?
I want to respect the agenda. If we, I don't know how much flexibility is built in, Rich or Peter, but I did have a kind of a reflection that I wanted to offer based on what TJ said and following on what you said, Rich. But if there's not time, also happy to hold that till a later conversation.
I think we're probably doing okay. So
I agree with what you said, TJ, and with what you said, Rich. I will say that I think it's difficult to know until the clean heat standard is implemented what will be the kind of mix and the relative kind of weight or share given to different clean heat measures in terms of compliance. I will say that I do think that there are some key attributes of weatherization and of equipment installations that to me, give me hope that they're going to play a really large role in clean heat standard compliance. And maybe I'll just offer those now. I mean, again, this is kind of informed prediction, but we would have to wait to see how it plays out. But, you know, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of a fuel supplier, an obligated party, one of the things you want is clarity over the long term that you're going to be able to meet your requirements under the clean heat standard. And one of the benefits of either doing directly or paying others for weatherization is that you're getting clean heat credits for the life of that measure, which I believe in the most recent technical advisory group, the technical resource manual, I think is like a 25-year measure. So you're able to get clean heat credits over that entire time span, versus if you're doing something like biofuels, not only are you only getting partial credit because of the carbon intensity of biofuels not being zero, as opposed to fossil fuel not used at all once you've done weatherization. You know, biofuels only getting credit for 1 year. And so I do think that there's the potential for the clean heat standard to incentivize and you know, have funding from fossil fuel suppliers that need to meet the clean heat obligations to be going to weatherization. But I also 100% agree that we don't know what exactly that threshold is yet, and we should not rely, even if it is going to be high, we shouldn't rely on it solely or even primarily to meet our weatherization targets, especially knowing that for low and moderate income weatherization, those per project costs are generally higher. And those are, from an equity perspective, the ones we most want to make sure are happening in low and moderate income homes and apartments, versus if a fuel supplier is just thinking about the cost per ton avoided, it's going to be easiest for them to incentivize you know, a small amount for an upper income weatherization that could potentially result in significant emissions reduction, but without having to put much money into that project. So those are just some additional considerations. I think that the same thing is true on the equipment side. You know, and this would all have to be developed by the PUC and the PSD and the technical advisory group that gets established. But if you can have a measure that is an advanced wood heat boiler or a pellet stove or a heat pump system that is going to be in place and reducing emissions for 15 or 20 years, that can give the fuel suppliers a degree of confidence and clarity about future year obligations, where if you're just relying on the biofuel market, you know, even though some biofuels are definitely carbon better than fossil fuels, many of them retain the same characteristics of being a commodity that is subject to wild price swings and price volatility. And if you're a fuel supplier that needs to know you're going to meet your credit obligations in 2025, do you want to have a ton of exposure to biofuel prices that could double overnight? I think, again, we're going to have to wait to see how that all plays out, but I think those are important considerations.
Thanks, Jared. We will have to see how it plays out. Absolutely. Any other comments on that one? The environmental justice bill, is there someone prepared to speak to
Yeah, I can
that?
provide a quick update there. So there's been a considerable amount of discussion in Senate Natural Resources and Energy on the environmental justice bill, including a request for and the development of a fiscal note from the Joint Fiscal Office that because it has funding or money spending associated with it, it's in Senate appropriations now, and it's a little unclear whether there's going to be the resources available to support the bill as it's currently scoped out. There's a lot of work in there, and there may need to be some refinement of what the priorities are in that bill in terms of working towards overall environmental justice efforts in the state. So it's a little unclear, frankly, at this point, but the fiscal note from all of the state agencies named in the bill was somewhere along, I think, in the vicinity of like $4.8 million annually, which is hard money for the Appropriations Committee to find. So it would be better to address scope and dollars available now before the because the other option for Senate appropriations is essentially to strip any discussion of funding from the bill and move it back to the floor. And so it becomes a mandate without any source of dollars, which is not a good situation for the bill to be in. So just wanted to provide that update to you all.
Thanks, Peter. Any questions on these last couple of topics? Okay, then. Let's turn to the work.
Rich,
Yeah.
Rich,
Oh, Dina, comment?
I wanted to ask about the T-bill
Yeah.
and where it stands. There's really important funding for Mileage Smart. I guess Andrew just told me it's out of the committee in Ways and Means, but for those of you who've been sitting in on those discussions, are there any speed bumps or problems, or are things going to go smoothly?
Yeah, I can't speak to any bumps that might come down the road here, but
I don't know if
I can-
Joey or others been involved.
Well, Andrea, do you want to recap for folks what's in it based on what's happened in the last couple of days?
sure. I can just go through the different funding for different programs. There's 12 million for new plug-in electric vehicles. There's 3 million for Mileage Smart, 3 million for Replace Your Ride. These are all the incentives. 1 million for e-bikes, 1 million for e-rec. And then it goes, those are all the incentives. Then we've got a bunch for the EVSE build out. 6.25 million for highways, 10 million for multi-unit dwellings, community workplace, some of that going specifically to state workplaces. There's a pretty complex breakdown of that $10 million. $3 million for parks and fish and wildlife. There's some mention of microtransit and the mobility and transportation innovation grants. And then some other language in there that talks about converting fixed routes to microtransit, where that has been an issue in the past, as I understand it. So there's the potential to use monies for that. There's zero public fare. There's some language in there about using money from the IIJA carbon reduction program to meet the goals of the climate action plan in the future, not right now. There's no specific money for that because that program isn't out yet. There is a bike ped pilot program that I'm not sure of the details on that, but all those things sort of relate to the work that is in here, and the bunch of the recommendations or the asks that came through the Transportation Innovation Act. So quite a bit of alignment in those. So that's where that stands in.
Quick
Go ahead.
update. Sorry, I'm keeping my camera off. My internet's a little shoddy. So House Transportation was in House Appropriations this morning to brief on the T-bill and walked through all of the items that Andrew just walked through. As of noon, House Appropriations, it sounds like there's concern that a number of the climate initiatives in the T-bill, while earmarked for ARPA, are not actually ARPA eligible. That seems to be the guidance that the committees are getting from JFO. So House Appropriations seems to be committed to trying to find funding for most of those initiatives. They noted favorability on other climate initiatives, but as of noon today, they hadn't gotten to that point yet. They have to by tomorrow, so we should hear something by then.
It's important to know.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that, Marion.
You know, I think once the dust settles on these bills, we need to figure out how much we have vis-a-vis the plan, what the gap is. So we go into next year with eyes wide open in terms of our EV targets. I don't know who's going to do that work. Somebody needs to do that work. Maybe that
Who's going to figure out where we are in meeting the goals?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Because if we can assume a certain amount of incentive, a certain amount of EV charging infrastructure is needed to get to the numbers each year, then here's what we've got. Here's the gap.
Yeah, we're definitely looking at that through our contracts. Optimizing the incentives to get whatever vehicles come into the state. out on the road and actually in use. So that's definitely something we're looking at. And as far as the infrastructure, yeah, we're certainly doing that. And I think, we're doing it as the Agency of Transportation, but also in conjunction with the task group to understand how we're going to get to our goals. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Andrea. It's really useful.
Thanks for that report. Joey, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, just one last thing, and it may be connected to the conversation we're going to have in transportation later, which is they've been making a lot of progress and I think really taking the climate action plan very seriously in the legislature, which is great. There are a few things like in the transportation space, for example, like obviously they're not lifting everything. They're only human. There's a lot that they're going through, but like things like the vehicle efficiency price adjuster that we'd recommended the legislature take up, or the authorizing legislation for readying if a cap and invest program does move forward for the state to sort of receive those revenues. Anyway, I'm just curious, and I just wonder about sort of just trying to follow what they've done and what they haven't done that we'd recommended, so we can just be abreast of that or potentially urge them in the direction. And mostly I'm thinking about that from the transportation space because of the significant gap we currently still have. So anyway, I just want to flag that, and it's a process question.
It sounds like you and Gina were basically raising the same point. We need to know what we're going to be getting from all of these complementary programs in order to know how big the gap is for major initiatives that we might need to recommend coming out of the task group. But that's a perfect segue, as you said, to a report from the task group. Where are you? What's going on?
Everyone's read it, Jane. Everyone's doing it. Jane, do you want to give a report on the transportation, or I can start, and Gina and Jane and Andrea and others weigh in. So I'll start and others can sort of weigh in. Okay, the transportation task group is really in the process of, and I think Jane just delivered to the full council and the subcommittees a memo from the task group, sort of contextualizing where we're at and sort of beginning to sort of point towards some of the options that we might look to consider. I'm going to let Jane and Andrea fill you in on the sort of technical analysis and support that they may be finding the dollars to deliver. Clearly, we are going to need that. But in the meantime, I can drop into the chat or that memo that I hope others will read, that really sort of grounds us in the moment that we're in. And then accompanying that, we've been really focused in on sort of ramping the public engagement and the process component of that work. And, flag it for you to put on your agenda that our first foray into that is on April 1st. We are hosting our first public webinar. It will be virtual, and it will lean on our fabulous team, including Secretary Moore, who will sort of ground us in where we're at, how the cap does or doesn't add up, especially in the transportation arena, and sort of the pathways, the new pathways analysis and that modeling, and sort of contextualize what we know at this moment, and we need to know more about the gap we need to fill. And then Jared is going to, there's 3 parts to this April 1st initial webinar. Jared's going to sort of ground us in the different types of regulatory or policy tools that we're going to begin to examine, in particular performance standards, cap and invest programs, and potentially flagging a few other things. So nothing specific, no particular model, but like those just broad buckets of tools. And then the third big component of that is sort of breakouts, and ideally small group breakouts for public feedback and deeper conversation. So April 1st, noon to 1:30, virtual webinar, level set webinar. And then following quickly on the heels of that are the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition. Many of you very well may be aware of their work. Embedded in UVM is hosting a a webinar on a clean transportation standard that is a performance-based mechanism. One of the things that we have identified, analogous to a clean heat standard in the thermal space, a clean transportation or low carbon fuel standard in the transportation sector is one of those potential approaches we're going to explore further. And Vermont Clean Cities has done some of this work and putting together a webinar that we're going to ideally use as one, sort of encourage people to attend to learn more about, how other states are exploring clean transportation or low carbon fuel standards. So that is April 5th at 1:30. So you don't need to scramble and take notes. We'll follow up, and Jane has already on the April 1st event in particular, but we'll follow up with more information and really hope to encourage Climate Council members and subcommittee members and the broad public and stakeholders to join us in these conversations as we ramp, our work to sort of look at the options, understand what the gap is, then look at the options that we could potentially employ to fill it. And to do that, we're going to need some technical support and analysis. And I don't know if anyone wants to round out what I've shared, or if I can turn it over to Jane or Andrea to talk about that component of the work. AKA fill in the blanks, everything I might have missed, people.
I'm happy to move into like the technical analysis, which will help support maybe what you said, but don't have any gaps to fill in. That was great. So for everybody's benefit, the webinar, in order to plan for that April 1st webinar, it's actually sort of some of the baseline work that we need to do to further understand the questions we want to ask through the technical analysis work that we want to do. So in order to sort of level set and change the discourse around filling a TCIP hole, trying to really explain what sort of the policies and recommendations within the current cap get us in the form of emissions reductions to the best of our knowledge, and show what that gap is between what they get us and what the statutory requirements are, to be explicit and clear on what we're trying to fill now with additional policy recommendations. And to remind everyone, that timeline was adopted by the council for us to do that this fall. So the council will really come back and have a lot of work, I think, in the fall around budget planning for the coming, for the next budget cycle, as well as thinking about taking up additional addendums to the climate action plan in the transportation space and the biomass space, which we'll talk about after transportation today. And so for transportation, we have a remaining budget within the GWSA budget that has a lot of things to go to. So we're trying to support the additional technical analyses that we know we need through first and foremost grant funding. And Megan O'Toole took the lead on applying for a $100,000 grant from the U.S. Climate Alliance to support the transportation work. It's a two-phase grant. The first phase being to do a more robust analysis of what our primary policy recommendations are within the CAP right now for transportation, which is around joining Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, to really understand the emissions reductions those two rulemaking will get us. And then to build a phase 2 of that analysis, likely in tandem, not waiting for one, but really building along that, to ask some questions around what are the most cost-effective and other things to add on. And I say that in a kind of confused way because it's very complicated. Andrea AOT is leading studies looking at VMT reductions right now, looking at optimizing incentives that will all inform what the comprehensive package is, but suspecting that we would need to make a recommendation as a task group first to this subcommittee and then to the council for a regulatory or policy framework that the council would need to adopt to drive emissions down. We need to have clear understanding of what the emissions reductions would be that we would realize from those, as well as the cost to the state and Vermonters on that behalf. So we're waiting on that grant. We have sort of a rough estimate that the work might cost in the $150,000 ballpark, or that's what we have capacity to try and support. So if the Climate Alliance grant comes through, we'll be able to put a large majority of that to this sort of phase 2 work. And then through AOT's budget and ANR's GWSA budget will come up and support the remaining funds needed. I think if we weren't able to get the Climate Alliance grant, we would likely not be able to support 150,000. It'd be a smaller ask, but we'll still hopefully be able to pull together the $100,000 to $150,000 range of a contract in this space. So there's a group. There's the Transportation Task Group meeting regularly once a week now. We're meeting on Mondays and have a set time now from 3:30 to 5 if folks ever want to join. And then we also have a transportation RFP development group meeting that also is informing the development of the presentation for that webinar on the 1st on Fridays. We're meeting. So lots of work in the transportation space. And excited that we sort of have a great team working on it. So it feels good.
Thank you. Questions about any of that? The agenda lists, Joey and Jane, the topic of updates on rulemaking. Is this for advanced clean cars and trucks?
Yeah, and I do see Megan's here, but I just want to really put forward how much time and capacity the rulemaking process is taking for DEC staff, and how that's really the primary focus for folks like Megan and Deirdre right now. And know that the council meeting in May will focus on the rulemaking process because the rules need to be presented to the council 45 days ahead of them going to ICAR on July 1st. So we plan that council meeting around the rulemaking process. And also just want to say that the Transportation Task Group is coordinating closely, obviously with Megan's deep engagement around the rulemaking process, also because the GWSA speaks to more robust public engagement in the rulemaking space than it does anywhere else in the GWSA, and requires us to do really robust public engagement this summer as we advance those rules. So we'll be thinking about, and the parameters around what we have to do in the rulemaking public engagement space are quite broad in nature. So it enables us to think holistically about when we're going out to the public this summer around advanced clean cars 2 and advanced clean trucks, ways that we can also be messaging about the ongoing need in the space for further recommendations in the transportation space. So Megan, please, if I muddied anything, jump in, but I just wanted to really appreciate that there's a lot of work happening right now to advance those rules, and Megan is the leader of that.
Any further comments? Comments from Megan or Deirdre?
Hey, everybody. Sorry, I just put in the chat, but that's, yeah, what Jane said is great. And I think really captures what we're working on and what our priorities are.
Okay. Do you have any estimate of what the contribution of those 2 rules is going to be relative to the requirements that we're trying to meet?
So that's something that
EAN.
that's something that we're working on right now. And we're hoping to have a rough picture of what that looks like for the April 1st webinar. And then we'll continue to flesh that out and refine that with the help of some contractors before we, file the rulemaking packet with ICAR in July. But it's kind of it's a work in progress, but we're kind of adding pieces to it as we go along through like public engagement opportunities and, the milestones that Jane mentioned regarding, when we need to be notifying the council and the committees of jurisdiction in the legislature and then ICAR. So we don't have a lot of time. So we're trying to just build it and make it as robust as we can as we go.
Okay, thanks. Anything further on the Transportation Working Group? Sounds like you have a lot of things going on.
I just want to say, to the degree you are able to pencil in the noon on the 1st, it'd be great to have this team there and as many other people as possible. So your help in promoting would be great as well.
Chris,
Yeah, just note briefly, I'm working with Andrea to try to get RPC engagement in this so that we can have some additional support, Johanna and Gina. So hopefully we'll know soon. And just I put in the chat, I really wanted to be at the webinar, but I'm going to be talking to other folk around the country about nuclear plant decommissioning and preparing for it. So sorry, I'll have to miss that. But I guess there'll be a recording. I'll catch up with it then. But thanks for pulling it together so quickly, and glad it's happening.
thanks, Chris. I'm glad the rest of the country will get to hear you on a topic that you know a lot more about than almost everybody.
They didn't teach it in school, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Okay, transportation. That seems to, oh, Jane, something more?
I was just thinking about public engagement opportunities. Just want to mention this, I haven't shared this with the full council yet, but we've also settled on the 2 dates for our broad-based engagement, which is April 12th and April 13th, where we plan to hold CBI facilitated events where we talk very briefly about the climate action plan, but really focus in on the ongoing work of the council, and have 2 proposals that we've been working on with CBI on how to do that. And the public engagement task group will be focused on discussing those 2 models next Monday afternoon. And so encourage, I know I've sent it, I believe, Joey, we've sent it to you to encourage you to think about joining us, to think about how transportation is one of those key components that we'll want to use those meetings to engage with Vermonters about the ongoing work. So making sure that that is fleshed out. And so I think that'll just be a good topic to also think about with the transportation task group when they meet later on the same day after the public engagement group meets. But there'll be a lot of opportunities coming up to talk about transportation too, with in the context of the plan.
Thanks, Jane. Now let's take up a report from Biomass. Peter, can you lead us through this, please?
Sure, happy to, and I appreciate Liz and TJ, your support as well. I think one of the, the conversation, we had a meeting of, and just since we haven't had a chance to talk about it, Rich has run up against some conflicts, and so has asked for some additional support on the biomass work group. And so I told him that I would help out, and so it's now the membership from cross sector as TJ, Liz, and me. So just wanted to update you there. We had a good conversation on Monday with members from the Ag and Eco Subcommittee. I think we started to walk through kind of the shared expectations around what the charge is, and I think there's a lot of question about whether or not we have, or what are the policy questions we're trying to answer, and then what are the information needs we have to be able to inform good decisions. The biomass conversation is obviously one that is complicated. There's lots of questions around sort of the way in which we count emissions. There are issues of equity and traditional land expectations as well. There are a number of issues, and so trying to understand. I thought it'd be useful in developing this agenda to come speak with you all as we're there representing you, to think through some of those conversations, primarily around what are the policy questions we think that group should be focused on, and whether or not there's additional research that's needed. Because as we've talked about, one area is of the life cycle analysis that is considered as part of the overall climate action plan, and thinking about that as an additive measure to our inventory and the process to develop some of those questions is one in which there's a lot of sort of precursor work that would need to be done to answer some of those questions, and just figured it would be good for us to engage more fully as a subcommittee on the conversation. So I don't know if anybody has any initial thoughts. I can start to kind of go through. Jane or Marion, I don't know if we can drop the tabled actions link into the chat. That was a helpful reference for me, and I couldn't find it online. Perfect. Thank you, Jane.
Jared,
so-
on that, I
Yeah,
don't
go
know
ahead,
if you have
Jane.
a clarifying question for Peter, or if I might just provide a little more context for folks, if helpful.
It's a clarifying question, but I will wait to ask it until you've had the chance to provide more context, Jane.
Okay. I guess I just, for the benefit of the subcommittee, since we haven't all been involved in the biomass conversation and evolution from the climate action plan, just briefly, I'll just say that at the onset of the first meeting, there was a discussion about first and foremost representation of who will sit on that task group. For now, we've been focused on not bringing in outside experts, but rather focused on the two subcommittees that have jurisdiction over the work per se, which is having consistent 3 representatives from Ag and Eco, 3 representatives from cross-sector, and a point person from science and data, recognizing that there's a lot of interplay with the inventory and other components that are managed out of science and data. Knowing that ultimately those folks around the table would be better served by having, not better served, but served by having technical experts ultimately come in once the scope was refined. I think we went around about scope a bit and settled on a starting place, for better or worse, was the tabled actions that came out of Ag and Eco. But for everybody's reference, those tabled actions were not reached on, the subcommittee did not reach consensus on those. In fact, they were really worked on by a small group of subcommittee members in a private, like outside of subcommittee members. And because they ran out of time, the subcommittee essentially said, let's forward them as is and state that there was no consensus or discussion on them. So it just means we're starting from sort of an interesting place, because in order to sort of think about scope, we referenced the language in the cap, and the cap says that the group will take up the tabled actions from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, of which it's just an interesting place since nobody reached consensus on those either. And so we're starting with those tabled actions. And as we got to reach consensus on that as a starting place to define scope, we also were trying to bring clarity around perhaps where some of those tabled actions are already being worked on by other subcommittees, like life cycle analysis and further understanding of the way we account for biomass in our inventory. Yes, we want to think about that, but that doesn't need to be thought about perhaps in the biomass task group, because there's already somebody else thinking about it over there. And or thermal wood application, maybe we don't need to talk about that, because we as a council, through our approval of the clean heat standard, already said we support the use of thermal wood energy as a clean heat measure. So maybe that's settled also. We tried to get to bringing in some experts just to help us then go through the tabled actions, but we ran out of time last week. And it's now our job to come back to the next meeting, and either I'd like to propose, by going through the tabled actions, informed by this conversation and then informed by the Ag and Eco Subcommittee next week, what is germane to this task group and what isn't germane based on either the climate action plan or other work, and hopefully really narrow down the scope of that group in a way that feels manageable, reasonable, and appropriate for where we are in this process. And so today, hopefully this conversation will help give me some better information to then go through the tabled actions and put out a proposal to that task group to consider the next time we meet. And I'll just say those meetings have been happening publicly. That task group has a lot of interest and felt like the appropriate way to move that forward, despite it being not being a subcommittee, was to warn those publicly, have the public involved from the beginning to create a transparent conversation.
Thanks, Jane. I have hands up from Jared, Chris, and Christine in that order. Jared.
Thanks. So my question for Peter and Jane and anyone else who's been involved, I guess it's kind of in two categories. One is more substantive and one is more process. On the substantive side, and I don't have this in front of me right now, but my recollection was that among those kind of tabled recommendations were a pretty wide variety of kind of issues and considerations. And it felt to me like some of them, there were kind of different buckets that they might fall into. One would be issues that need more research and analysis and study to be able to have a really kind of informed, effective, productive conversation. Ones that there just maybe there is the moment is there is enough information at hand to be able to make a recommendation, and time, we just ran out of time and the ability to do the kind of cross subcommittee collaboration and discussion that would have been necessary to get there. But then I think that there's probably a third category of things that didn't move forward, not because of a lack of time or a lack of information, but just because there's disagreement and they may not be able to move forward if they're kind of issues where there's just it's not about a lack of information or needing more time, there's just fundamental disagreement. And so I think that I'm wondering to what degree given that, if I'm correct in that assumption that there is that kind of range of types of issues, how those different types are going to be treated in terms of coming up with like, what is the charge and the responsibility of this group and what can actually be done now, what needs to be waited for until there is additional research and information that can inform those conversations, and where might there need to be kind of an agree to disagree type approach. I would just say that like when it comes to something like life cycle analysis, including on biomass, to me, it's not just a question of how do we assess those emissions factors. That also then relates to some of these other questions about the role of biomass in policy. So like, it would feel weird to me to advance a policy recommendation related to biomass when we have not yet gotten back the research and analysis we want on life, not just for the sake of a supplemental accounting for the inventory, but to actually inform policy recommendations. So I guess I'm a little bit wondering and worried about things kind of moving ahead of the information we know we need. And so the last point I will make is on a process. It seems I'm seeing in the chat, there's like a recommendation of 3 reps from cross sector, 3 from Ag and Eco, and 1 from Science and Data. I'm not really clear how it was decided or if there has been a formal decision about what the composition of that task group has been. My recollection has been that for most ad hoc task groups, it's, you know, the volunteers of the subcommittees that are willing to participate, it's kind of open. And I just personally want to make sure to say that I'm not comfortable with kind of an arbitrary limit of 1 person from Science and Data. I think that I think Megan, our co-chair, is interested in participating, and I hope she does. But I would also note we have, as Jane and some others know, in the request for subcommittee recommendations, one of the areas of experience and expertise that we were looking for was someone with life cycle emissions expertise. And so it may be very possible that someone we would add to that subcommittee could be very helpful to this conversation. And I wouldn't want to kind of arbitrarily say there can only be one person from science and data if there are additional people from that subcommittee or other subcommittees who could be helpful to a really grounded and productive conversation.
Thanks, Jared. Chris?
Yeah, I just want to, I'm not exactly sure how this fits. I've mentioned this previously, I think, but we really need to do some outreach and education about what we're talking about on biomass, what it is and what it's not, because there's so much misconception out there about what it could be. And I think I mentioned at the last council meeting, I mean, I'm fundamentally opposed to chewing up the bottomland hardwoods that I love down south to send to Germany, but that's different than the wood that we're trying to provide, you know, get into the modern wood heating systems that we help support here in the Windham region. So I think that's critical, because otherwise I'm afraid that the other, I don't know, I'm afraid things may get ahead of us and kind of taint the well, as it were. So, you know, like having Andy Perschlick talk about the modern wood heat programs of the CEDF, I would be happy to provide our staff person who's been managing our modern wood heat project here in the Windham region, if we wanted to do something. And also West Hills Energy Consulting, they're doing an evaluation of our program. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to be done. I don't think it's too long, but we'll have that. But anyway, just wanted to suggest that, because we've had some thermal projects here face some fierce opposition just from folk who just heard biomass and wood and assumed that it was going to be it was going to chew up all the forests of southeast Vermont.
Thanks, Chris. Christine?
Yeah, I mostly just want to thank you, the three of you, for being willing to continue to engage in this conversation. It's so important that we slog through these issues and try to get some resolution. And it's been building for decades. And I very much support the way in which you're framing the roles and the assignment at this point in time, given where the process was when you all stepped into it. I guess I'm curious, can you remind me who the three ag and ecosystem representatives are who happen to be on the biomass task force work group?
Jane?
Yes, it's Judy Dow, Billy Coster.
Yep.
I cannot believe I'm drawing a blank.
Charlie Hancock.
Oh, Charlie Hancock, of course.
Charlie Hancock.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I just quickly read through the memo of tabled items, or whatever you're calling it, and yeah, there's a lot that's pretty loaded in there already. So I think it's good to do whatever the work is to chip away at increasing understanding and awareness of both the attributes and, you know, and the cautionary aspects of biomass in a rational, fair, and credible way. And I support your work in helping to make that happen.
All right, thanks. Peter, do you have I mean, you asked some questions generally that you'd like some guidance from the committee. We've heard some feedback.
We have one more hand up.
Okay, Joey.
I definitely would love to hear what Peter has to say. And I think this is a really important conversation, and one we should dig into really deeply. I do think that, you know, the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment is going to be critical to inform this conversation and the council's work more broadly. So I just want to take this moment to really encourage us and potentially, and like side note, ask the steering committee to consider and potentially prioritize that funding for that effort, because I think it is inextricably connected to and should fundamentally inform this really important, really important conversation. So I appreciate that this conversation is happening. But I also wonder too, and I attended the first biomass task group. I have not been able to follow it since then, just because for a variety of reasons, including the transportation work. But I would also really encourage, and maybe this is the work that we do as a subcommittee, it seems like this task group should really ground itself in the work that has been done to date in the state. You know, I think the past 10 years in particular have sort of set a tone and a direction for how the state should move on biomass. You know, for example, is recognized by the Public Utility Commission in the North Springfield biomass decision when there was a proposal for an electric, you know, like large scale electric led biomass facility that, you know, the PUC essentially said it's really critical to have life cycle greenhouse gas emissions accounting for new plants. And they also pointed toward, in addition to accounting for existing large scale plants. So it seems like that, you know, that sort of foundation of like work that has been done to date, you know, biomass is, you know, I think work has been done related to the comprehensive energy plan, again, sort of prioritizing thermal advanced wood heat applications. And, you know, I think for us as a climate council, a big piece of our work is really about looking at the carbon sort of benefits and consequences holistically. And I just, again, want to wrap by saying, I fundamentally think a life cycle GHG assessment would be really important to inform this work and other conversations. So I kind of wonder about sort of the timing of it and the process, and wonder if that's like a first fundamental foot forward, and would ask us to urge the steering committee to potentially prioritize that as a really important thing connected to this conversation and beyond.
Thanks, Joy. I appreciate that comment. I think, so my question, my guess, I sort of, to go back to Jared's buckets of sort of items that we need more information about, items that we need more time to discuss and resolve language on, and then those where there are fundamental disagreements with what are put forward in the tabled measures. I don't know. I feel, and TJ and Liz, I'd love your perspective on this. Is sort of, I feel a little bit out on the, you know, out on a limb without your knowledge of what all of your perspectives are on some of those issues. And so I was hoping to guide through this conversation around those topics.
I'm happy to weigh in first, just to follow up on the comment I made in the chat, that I agreed with Jared's perspective on this. Specifically, what I was referring to, and it kind of gets to what you were asking about, Peter, is Jared's later point that it's hard actually perhaps to make the categorizations with the work that is outstanding and will be done on the life cycle accounting. In other words, you know, if we all agree, which I believe the subcommittee members have stated that they do, that, you know, the conversation should be grounded in science and common understanding, as well as equity and the other principles we've discussed. Some of that work may need to happen in order to understand whether there's fundamental disagreements, and in order to understand whether there are sort of priority items. So, you know, reluctantly, I've said this to the subcommittee members, reluctantly, I'd be of the opinion that though we as a council indicated we wanted a subgroup to take this up and to start with the, you know, non-consensus framework that was presented to us in November, you know, upon consideration, given the other work that we know is outstanding and that is fundamental and kind of baseline almost for this discussion, it might be better to not take the, you know, days and hours of time that otherwise will happen to discuss these issues prior to having that work product. And at that point, it may be that there could be a broader way of engaging and representing and, you know, kind of taking care of some of the other issues that I know the subcommittee members have been concerned about in terms of representation and voice, and hearing from all of the perspectives that we need to hear from. So.
All right, thanks, Liz. Peter, you were asking for some other inputs too, but I just have a clarification question. Since I sense that there's a lot of support on this subcommittee for developing the scientific basis or life cycle analytic basis to think about biomass before we tackle the resulting policy questions about various uses of biomass. So I'm putting that forward as a suggested point of agreement on this committee. We can test that. But if that's our position, my factual question is, where is that work being done, or where has that work been done that we would assemble and then use that as the foundation for the policy questions that are raised by the tabled items? You know, if we're saying science first, then look at the tabled items, see where we agree, where we disagree, what our policy recommendations are. You know, that's a logical way for this committee to proceed. And I'm now asking, can you help us out by telling us where that information exists or where it's going to come from?
So what I was going to say kind of gets to some of your question, I think, Rich, in that this task group still needs to develop a work plan. And so it's really what comes first or what doesn't. Life cycle analysis is one piece of the puzzle to inform the tabled, you know, consideration of the tabled framework. I like how you put that, Liz, because it is non-consensus. So it's just kind of these issues that are out there. And so there's other things and other pieces of information that we need, and a whole lot of learning by both groups of members of the subcommittee that's needed. What are the real impacts to surrounding communities if you're talking about electric generation? What are the you know, it's the whole breadth of impacts. What are the economic impacts to the wood industry of, you know, in Vermont, which is, you know, a really important part of the fabric of Vermont. And so there's all these different pieces. And to me, I think the next step, and I hope we go there, and is to really kind of define what we don't know and what we need to know, and then try and work out a plan to get to your question, Rich, of, well, how do we, who's answering that? Who's going to be the one in charge of saying, we need, yeah, this is what we believe to be the impacts to surrounding communities and the information we drew from, and here's the plan to get that information. I think we 2 meetings ago, maybe we tried to jump into the tabled actions a little early, and we again started to do that and go through, but a little more measured right at the end of the last meeting. But it's so I don't think there's a good answer to your question, but it's the right question in that we need to kind of define that path forward. And even before we define that, I forgot who said it today, but we need to define what we mean by advanced wood heat, what we mean by the different types of biomass. Maybe that was Chris that was talking about that, and what we mean by the each term that we're using, because so easily we're jumping right into talking past each other and being in conflict with what we think we know the terms are. And I think this is going to be a really long process. You know, I think originally we didn't get to resolution in this, but it was brought up that originally we had kind of a June timeframe to report back, just like the transportation work group did. That is, to me, nowhere near the time necessary to kind of start to tackle these issues. But so I'll stop there. Not a complete answer to your question, Rich, but some more context maybe.
But I think the other piece that I just want to add to that kind of series of questions is there's the challenge, I think, that I've run into in trying to sort of parse out how we do this work. I think the cleanest version is, as Liz suggested, doing the life cycle analysis and any other work that we think is appropriate prior to having the conversation in robust form, is that there are a number of sort of value-based recommendations in here that I think we could potentially debate and discuss now, but I'm not sure that they feel like they would not help with us trying to resolve the issues if we get into those value-based conversations immediately, rather than having sort of starting with what we know from the life cycle analysis and determining the sort of the primarily the sort of greenhouse gas benefits of biomass usage in Vermont, and then scale more broadly into other considerations, any policy perspectives folks have on how we address biomass usage in Vermont. But it has to start from the work of this, to my mind, of this council, which is in the reduction of emissions.
So, Peter, do I get it that when you use the term life cycle analysis, you're also looking at greenhouse gas emissions avoided by the use of biomass in different end uses, as opposed to looking at natural resource flux in the biomass resource alone? Have I stated that correctly? I mean, it's one thing, I mean, for example, I mean, the tabled actions make a distinction between biomass for electricity and biomass for distributed heat. And most people do make that distinction. And the degree to which those applications avoid greenhouse gas emissions varies. So that seems to be a part of the life cycle analysis that needs to be, taken into consideration. I'm wondering whether you mean that when you say life cycle analysis.
To me, the life cycle analysis of an individual fuel is not that helpful, as we've talked about, right? You need to be able to do comparisons across different fuel types and uses in order to understand what has the best value from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective to Vermont. So to my mind, that's why doing a sort of partial biomass life cycle analysis separate from the other life cycle analysis wouldn't actually be that useful. So yes, the answer to your question is yes.
All right. So your recommendation to the task group would be, we need to understand the life cycle analysis before we begin as developing a set of policy recommendations, and the life cycle analysis that we need is compares biomass against other end uses or energy carriers, I guess you'd say. I'm trying to clarify what you would recommend to the working group, and that's what it sounds like.
So yeah, and I don't know, frankly, this is a little awkward. I don't know if we make that recommendation to the working group, right? I feel like this is almost a recommendation to the council that says, I'm not sure this is ripe yet, right? There are issues here that we can debate and discuss for ever and have been for the past, many years, but we're not going to fully resolve, those we're not going to have a change in that conversation without some additional research to help inform us. And that, to my mind, that's the knowledge around the life cycle emissions accounting of the fuels that we've been, sort of the in addition to the standard inventory, the work that would be done to evaluate further life cycle emissions.
Okay, and TJ and others are pointing out that we would also want to assemble information on other aspects of the biomass question, including the forest products industry and ecological benefits of forest resources, what have you. So, Peter, then I'm not
So,
I'm-
so I guess,
I'm trying to go somewhere with this conversation that's just not, that's beyond just a conversation where we get a committee recommendation. So
Yes.
forgive me.
no,
You
I appreciate you continuing to tease it out. I'm trying to, I guess my recommendation here, let me put it this way. I think my recommendation is to go back to the work group and say, we've discussed this in great depth, and we think that that there are several things that we need to do further analysis, research on, and to TJ's point about additional factors that need to be discussed. Let's put together our sort of information need list first, and then determine when we gather back to evaluate that information in light of the non-consensus tabled action framework.
Okay, thank you, Peter. But you also said you actually think this is a recommendation that needs to be made to the council as a whole.
I think based on the fact that, sort of the additions that TJ added, I think it's probably worth running it back to the work group first and say, we think that let's go through what we need to be able to make informed decisions here and define what those are, and then determine what that process is for answering them. And if we can't come to consensus together, then we can bring it back to the council and say that.
Okay, thank you. Jared and Joey, you've got hands up.
Thanks, Rich. One of the things I'm kind of sensing is a question of balance here is, on the one hand, it's been really helpful to have a task group model where we can ask some folks who have some experience, expertise, commitment to kind of dive deep, and then bring that back to either a subcommittee or to the full council. But at the same time, if there's a final decision that needs to be made on the case of a policy recommendation or otherwise by the full council, I think it's also important that that all councilors have the ability to kind of feel comfortable that they know the context and they know some of the kind of pros and cons and trade-offs. And so I'm actually thinking back to the beginning of our work together as a council. And even though it kind of felt like it took a long time, I thought it was really helpful to have some of those initial context setting presentations so that we had a sense of common information. And I think that that's what we're moving towards on the transportation task group and public engagement with the webinars that are planned. And I almost wonder, I'm going to be the first person to say that our policy conversations should be grounded in evidence and data and the best available science. But I think that should not be to the exclusion of or trump other really important perspectives that are more value-based. And I think there needs to be an elevation and a highlight of not just science-based knowledge, as important as that is. And I'm just wondering, before we go into a question of should we do X or Y, would the council as a whole, I think I would, I don't know if I can speak for others, benefit from some initial presentations where, especially if the task group can, as TJ said, agree on, here are some of the key questions that we eventually want to get to. Some we may not be able to get to until longer term, but in the context of some of that agreement, have an initial set of presentations so that we can just have some common understanding and language of where people are coming from. I mean, I just did a brainstorm of some folks whose perspective I would love to hear if we organize some council webinars on this topic to really help ground us in many of the different considerations that include ecosystems, economics, emissions. I mean, there's so many different ones, right? Like I just made a list. I would love to see Ali Kasiba's presentation, who's the carbon forester ANR. I would love to see a presentation from Judy Dow about how she thinks about this in a different perspective. From Adam Sherman, who's one of the leading experts in the world on assessing biomass. NESCOM has done really good work, the Northern Forest Center, and none of those all agree. And so I think if we're gonna, at the end of the day, ask the council to come down on a recommendation or a policy choice, it could be first helpful to have a better sense of the span of opinion and where there's agreement versus where there's disagreement and why.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Joey?
I mean, I think Jared generally made a point that I wanted to make is that would be incredibly helpful. And I think that broad scope of the question, I think would be helpful to contextualize. And, you know, you rattled off of some really fabulous folks that I would very much like to hear from. And I think the council would benefit for hearing from. Again, to my point of when it comes to like, again, putting my hat on with this subcommittee and then the legally binding requirements of the climate action plan, knowing that thankfully the climate action plan requires a comprehensive analysis. I would love to see, add to your short list, a presentation by the Public Service Department and on how, you know, how existing programs have dealt with this to date. Like, again, how is the comprehensive energy plan pointing in this direction? What's in the renewable energy standard? You know, like what, you know, some of those precedents that I was talking about before, those also seem very important to me. I also think like there are a couple, you know, Chris raised a really important question about like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about like woody biomass, or are we talking about biofuels? I think we need to really clarify what we're talking about. And if others know that, please share that. But I think there does not seem to be clarity around what we're talking about in terms of those things. Is it bioenergy, you know, sort of soy crops? What are we actually talking about?
Well, in the tabled actions, the definition of biomass is essentially woody biomass. You know, and I know that many of us are aware that there are lots of issues with agriculture, soil sequestration, a number of other aspects of you know, natural resource carbon flow is the subject of the council, but and the council might want to look at all those things. So I'm not speaking for the council, obviously, but our task is to look at the topics in those tabled actions, and the definition of biomass there it focuses on woody biomass. So, I mean, it's an open question whether we want to recommend to the council that we have separate or additional information about soil sequestration and manure management and biofuels, but I don't think that's, you know, the genesis of this conversation.
I appreciate all that's been said.
Can I just
go ahead, do it.
Really quick follow-up? I guess I'm assuming that, you know, I mean, this is really the first, among the first substantive conversations we've had about this. Did the thermal, like Christine Dave Farnsworth, did you guys dig into this at all? I'm just curious, like to what degree? Like to help answer that question.
No, we did not. We had, there was some sharing between Billy Coster and us by Billy on behalf of Ag and Ecosystem to share some language that they've been thinking about. And as I recall, we tried to make sure there was some commonality in the phrasing that we used, but we did not go deep into biomass. Part of that was the nature of our recommendations were at a higher level. You know, we were really focusing on weatherization at scale and the clean heat standard, which references advanced wood heating. So that's what I recall as an answer to your question, Joey.
And Joey, as you know, in the legislation, there's you know, a pretty strong set of provisions concerning life cycle analysis on any fuel being credited for clean heat, and that would include biomass. So there's a life cycle requirement built into the legislation.
So let's go to Chris and let's see if we can wrap this conversation.
There's another piece of this. I just want to raise it. because of the war in Ukraine, I'll put a link here. Already the projections are for just a massive hunger crisis globally. And then what happened in 2008 now when the price of oil shot up was a lot of conservation land went into oil crop production, grain crop production, not just in the United States, but globally. But a lot of CRP and this didn't affect Vermont so much, but the Midwestern states now, a lot of land that had been put into conservation programs got taken out. And it might, I don't know how others feel about this, but I would argue it's probably worth the council actually taking a position on, at the present time, what's the policy position on biofuels? Because I don't know if folk remember in 2008, there were, protests in the streets around the world because the Western world was putting food into their gas tanks, literally. And this is not a light issue. I mean, we can't say, we have to find out what this balance is. And I know Vermont's a relatively small contributor to the overall picture, but globally, it's a big effing question. I know the Ukraine farmers are trying to get into their fields right now, but when you're being bombed, that's not necessarily that easy to do. And we have no idea how long this is going to last. So, we can wait a little bit, but at some point, I think it's from a just transitions perspective, it's something is a legitimate issue that we're going to have to take up. And again, I know this is just state policy, but what our position is, I think is going to, it's part of the global community. It's going to be important, whatever, and how we respond to this, pulling all these different pieces together. So I just don't want us to be blind to what the implications are globally across a lot of different factors that we included in the climate action plan.
Thanks, Chris. Peter, you wanted to maybe do a wrap up?
Yeah, I'm just sort of I gotta say, I'm sort of, you guys have all, you are voicing the struggle that I have in my own brain about how to frame out this conversation in a way that gets us to seek some resolution on these important questions. And I think the questions that Jared has raised around sort of what are we doing now has not been a significant topic in the conversation. Sort of what are the different perspectives that are out there on how we might do it differently have not been a huge part of the conversation. And it feels like we're starting from some words on a page that were some people's ideas and good ones, but not necessarily a complete perspective. And it's hard for me to engage from there. So with that in mind, I think I would propose with TJ and Liz, I'd be looking, I know Liz had to drop off for a PUC proceeding, that around sort of bringing back the idea of let's have a conversation around sort of how do we frame this out from an education standpoint and a knowledge generation standpoint and sharing standpoint, so that we can understand sort of the breadth of the challenges we're trying to tackle, and start there rather than jumping into questions that I don't feel capable of answering with the information we have now.
Okay, so if I can restate that as in the form of potential direction from the committee to our representatives. Peter, what you just said is you would like to talk to the task group and say that, the cross-sector committee has discussed this. And I'm trying to recall your exact words, but that you think that the task group should begin from a position of developing deeper understanding of both the science and the breadth of these issues first before diving into policy recommendations. And that if there's, I'm reaching back to something you said earlier, if there's disagreement at the test group level about how to proceed, that your recommendation would be that we ask the council what's the best way to proceed, and that folding in Jared's suggestion that Joey spoke to as well, that manner of proceeding might have two parts. One part is trying to get some updated life cycle analysis that would inform the discussions. And the second could be creating a forum in which a variety of points of view could be presented, whether they're based on science, the carbon counting or what have you, or not. TJ made the point also that we would want to consider the uses of biomass and what they're avoiding. And we would want to consider the importance of the forest economy, as well as forest ecology in the information that would be presented to the council. That was a lot of bits, but I'm trying to wrap up the recommendations I've heard from people. You want to either say you agree with that or I got it wrong, please go right ahead.
I think that's large, that sounded largely right to me. I wouldn't want to limit it to kind of just those ecological and economic. There's the human impacts as well. So it's somehow to write a statement that doesn't limit it, and I don't think you intended to at all. But but generally, I think you're right, and you framed that pretty well.
Okay, Bram.
I think as we sort of take this step back and think about presenting context, it would be really helpful for me, and I looked through the climate action plan and didn't find it, but it'd be helpful to understand. I mean, my understanding is biomass is used for a couple things. It's used for residential heat, and it's used potentially for distributed heat and for generating electricity. Kind of what percent of the electricity need is currently being met by my biomass? What percent of the heat need is currently being met by biomass? And I think, we've talked about the life cycle analysis, but it's important to understand how the use of biomass compares favorably or unfavorably with sort of conventional fossil fuel, but also how it compares favorably, unfavorably with other things. For instance, does biomass produce more emissions than heat pumps for heating a house? Or, even if we're talking about distributed heating, is there a way to look at that? As we sort of balance these very many complicated factors of emissions and cost, and how we reduce emissions, and how we provide substitutes for the emissions we're getting for doing the work that the emissions we're getting rid of were a result of, and all those things. I think that would be helpful.
Thanks. And those are all relevant questions, obviously. And I suspect that if we were putting together our list, we would include all the things you just mentioned, Bram.
Knowing we probably don't have enough time to sort of come up with a formal statement from the committee, I would ask sort of your blessing, and I'm seeing sort of nods around the room from the things we've talked about, to have TJ and Liz and I sit down and sort of formulate what we think sort of the message back to the task group is, and we can, take what are our sort of words and thoughts and try to put them down on paper in a way that might be easier to digest. And then have your blessing to share that with the task group.
I agree with that. Other people can comment if they disagree. I think this has been a really good discussion, raised a lot of good issues. But we have to, put it back in your hands to draft the committee's ask of the task group and or of the council if it comes to them. Thanks, Peter. And thanks everybody for a good conversation about some really complicated and important issues. And anything further on this, committee updates, et cetera, before we turn to public comment? Joey?
Can I just ask a process question? Remind me, Jane, if you would, there's a bunch of really important technical analysis and other things that need to be undertaken with very limited dollars. Remind me, I'm sorry, potentially remind all of us, where that conversation stands. And, there's $100,000 out there, and would we like to, in this moment, as a subcommittee, like to make a recommendation to the steering committee or to the council to fund a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment that would complement the inventory and be an important sort of prong to, to ensure that we have information we need to, make really thoughtful recommendations on policy and program design. It seems like we're lacking that. I know we're lacking a lot of things, but it's a process question and potentially a recommendation.
Yeah, the steering committee, the council was not able to reach consensus on what the priority analysis should be for that remaining funding that we have available through the GWSA budget. And the can was kicked to the steering committee meeting, which is the first week of April. I think it's April 4th, whatever that first Monday is. At which point I have shared and invited the full council to participate in that meeting, knowing that some councilors wanted it to just go to the steering committee for decision, and a handful of councilors thought it should be a full council meeting. So I just wanted to make sure we were as inclusive and let councilors know when that meeting was, and encourage them to come, and said that there would be space on the agenda for councilors to speak up in favor of different components. But so yeah, I think, Jared obviously is a steering committee member rep. And so I think if other councilors don't plan to be there, I think it would voice the strength of putting that funds towards the life cycle of analysis if Jared could say that the full cross-sector subcommittee was supportive of that.
Do you feel, Jared, that you have that message from us?
I think it's certainly helpful to know if I do. I mean, I'm hearing it from multiple people on this committee, certainly from Joey and Liz, and I'm seeing some other head nodding, but I think it would be good to just like pause and either see if there's any opposition to that or do a quick kind of straw sense, because I think it would be valuable information to be able to bring to that meeting and share with the rest of the steering committee.
Yeah, and just
Joey?
really quickly, I agree. Jared, you can send a general message, but if we wanted to provide a little more clarity, it might be helpful to send a stronger, more unified message. And again, Jane, there's a long list of things that we need to fund. Some of those ideally are going to have funding support from Climate Alliance for some of the, the ag, and carbon budget, like really important analyses. This one currently doesn't have that sort of glimmer of hope out there. So I just wonder if there's a nudge in that direction, or AKA a recommendation for their serious consideration among many important considerations would be helpful. I would urge us to go down that road.
Thanks. Anybody else? I think, Jared, that at least you have heard from this committee that we think that having much better information on life cycle impacts is important as a precondition for making progress on the policy issues involved in biomass policies. And that you can, I think, is a pretty clear statement of what our conversation has been so far today. How that ask compares with other asks on the list of ways to spend the money, can't comment on, there are probably a lot of other ways to spend the money. So that decision has to be made, looking at the whole list. And please speak up if you have something to add or disagree on any of this.
I also know, well, I think Liz has left, but we do also have the benefit of Chris being here as a steering committee member.
Okay. Conscious of the time, would like to open us up to hear from any members of the public who'd like to address the committee. And please raise a hand or speak up now. Thank you. I see Annette. Anybody else? Annette, please.
Thank you. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I wanted to respond to Bram's request for some comparisons and point out that from my observation, the fundamental problem is that Vermont considers biomass to be carbon neutral. And so, trees grow back in 50 or 100 years. And I see that as the fundamental problem with the should we say, the lack of discussion that's been going on at the Climate Council and in terms of the actual pollutants and effects. And so I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I strongly recommend that you add Zach Porter to the Biomass Task Force. He just has a tremendous amount of knowledge. It is very frustrating to be sitting in the bleacher seats continuously, especially when you have things to contribute. That's the role that Zach has been put in. My observations of the Biomass Task Force is that it is very unbalanced at this point. Judy Dow is having to carry the water for nature and the environment. And it's just not a well-constituted group the way it is now. I think it's an extremely important group. And I think that education is the first thing that's necessary because of this flawed assumption that burning trees for whatever purpose, whether it's heat or electricity, is not producing emissions. I'm really quite surprised that it's gotten to this point with the Climate Council, and it's still, as was presented at last week's Biomass Task Force meeting, that Vermont considers biomass to be carbon neutral. And I have also asked to be added to the group because of my work on electricity and land use issues. And if you're going to just add one person, please add Zach. But the task force, as it is currently formulated, is not representative of the knowledge and that I think that it needs to have to come up with really good information and conclusions. So thank you for giving me the chance to speak from the bleacher seats once again.
Thanks, Annette. Steve Crowley.
Hi, thanks. Well, Steve Crowley, South Burlington. I just, first of all, I want to second Annette's recommendation that you include Zach. He is so knowledgeable and speaks for many Vermonters. I know this for sure. And so I'd highly recommend that. Boy, you had such a great discussion today covering such important things. I mean, this idea that so many things are connected to each other, and when I think it's fine to have a group that focuses on the the woody biomass challenge, but that whole biofuels, bioenergy challenge is also immense and very important. And you had a great discussion. There's just it's hard to narrow down what I want to say, but I guess the one thing I would point out is I think that the stuff about Ukraine that Chris shared is a good example of how fragile and our system is, and the illusion that we are living in a stable world is shown to be an illusion when one country's having trouble producing its food, and the ripple effects are seen around the globe so quickly. And that will certainly happen as not just Vermont, but everybody starts looking at biofuels competing with cropland. And you add to that the fact that the climate is changing, and even without all that competition for energy crops, we're not going to be able to grow as much food. That those projections are a drop of 10 or 15% in crucial food crops, and an increase in price that people are predicting 50%. Absent all these intermittent crises, this is the global shift with climate change. So you add to that, I mean, this is such a huge stress point that it's just super important to consider those non-greenhouse gas impacts of all that bioenergy that we're talking about. It's absolutely crucial. Greenhouse gas stuff is super important, but the non-greenhouse gas impacts are huge. So thanks for that great discussion, and for all your work. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And anybody else? Any final comments from members of the committee? All right, then. Thanks, everybody, for a complicated, thoughtful discussion on a couple of really important topics. And I think we're adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.